London. The year is 1888. A city of empire. A city of power. A city where the richest people in the world lived only a few miles away from some of the poorest. But hidden beneath the lights of Victorian London was a world almost nobody wanted to see. A place called Whitechapel. A maze of narrow streets, crowded buildings, cheap lodging houses, and endless darkness. And inside that darkness, a killer was waiting. He had no known face, no confirmed identity, no confession, no arrest, only a name whispered in fear. Jack the Ripper. Between August and November of 1888, 5 women would be brutally murdered in the streets of East London. Their bodies would reveal a level of violence that shocked the entire world. The police would investigate. The newspapers would create a legend. And more than a century later, one question remains unanswered. Who was Jack the Ripper? Part 1. Whitechapel. The perfect hunting ground. To understand the murders, we first have to understand the city. Victorian London was the centre of the British Empire, a place of wealth, industry and progress. But that progress had a dark side. Millions of workers lived in terrible conditions. And in the East End of London, poverty was everywhere. Whitechapel was one of the most overcrowded districts in the city. Thousands of people lived packed together in tiny rooms. Many slept in common lodging houses where strangers shared beds. Some paid only a few coins for a place to rest. Others slept sitting up because they could not afford a bed at all. The streets were filled with disease, alcohol, crime and desperation. For many women, survival became a daily battle. Some turned to prostitution because they had no other way to earn money. These women were not simply victims. They were mothers, daughters, people with stories. But history would remember them mostly by the way they died. In the late summer of 1888, a series of murders began. At first, police did not know they were connected. Women had been attacked before. Violence was common in Whitechapel. But this killer was different. He did not simply murder. He appeared to be sending a message. The first victim, Mary Ann Nichols. August 31st, 1888. The early morning hours. A man walking through Bucks Row discovered something lying in the darkness. A woman's body. Her throat had been cut. Her body showed signs of extreme violence. The victim was identified as Mary Ann Nichols. She was 43 years old, known by friends as Polly. Her life had been difficult. She had struggled with poverty and addiction. Like many women in Whitechapel, she was trying to survive day by day. The night she died, she had been unable to pay for a bed. She needed money, and that need may have led her into the path of a killer. The murder shocked the neighbourhood, but there was something terrifying about it. The killer had escaped. No witness saw his face. No one knew where he went. The police had almost nothing, only a body, and a growing fear. The second victim, Annie Chapman. Only 8 days later, the killer struck again. September 8th, 1888. The body of Annie Chapman was discovered near Hanbury Street. She was 47 years old, a mother, a woman who had experienced years of hardship. Her death was even more disturbing than the first. The injuries suggested that the killer had become more confident, more controlled. He was not acting randomly. He appeared calm, methodical. The police began to consider a terrifying possibility. They were not looking for an ordinary murderer. They were looking for someone who had killed before. Witnesses reported seeing Annie shortly before her death. One woman claimed she saw Annie speaking with a man nearby. A man described as dark-haired, wearing a coat and a hat. A possible clue. But like many clues in this case, it led nowhere. The newspapers exploded with the story. London demanded answers. People wanted to know, who was this monster? Was he a stranger? Was he someone living among them? A neighbour? A worker? Someone they passed every day? Fear spreads through Whitechapel. As rumours spread, the streets changed. People became suspicious of everyone. Men walking alone at night were questioned. Foreigners were blamed. Workers were accused. The public wanted someone to punish. But the killer remained invisible. And then a new message appeared. A message that would create a legend. The letter that created a monster. September 1888. A letter arrived at the Central News Agency. It claimed to be written by the murderer. It began with the words, "Dear Boss." The writer mocked the police. He claimed responsibility, and he signed the name Jack the Ripper. At the time, investigators were not sure if it was real. Many believed it was a cruel hoax, a journalist's invention, a way to sell newspapers. But the name was unforgettable. The public accepted it, and from that moment, the killer had a title. The city looks for a monster. The police investigation expanded. Hundreds of people were questioned. Suspects were followed. Searches were conducted. But Whitechapel was a difficult place to investigate. Thousands of people lived there. Many had no permanent address. Many moved constantly. The killer could disappear into the crowd. And perhaps the most terrifying possibility, he already belonged there. September 30th, the double event. The night of September 30th would become one of the most important moments in the case. Two women would be attacked. The first was Elizabeth Stride. She was found in Dutfield's yard. Unlike the previous victims, her body showed fewer signs of mutilation. Some investigators believed the killer had been interrupted. Someone had scared him away. But if that was true, he was still nearby, still hunting. Less than an hour later, another body was discovered. Catherine Eddowes. Her murder was far more extreme. The killer had taken greater risks and left behind disturbing evidence. A piece of clothing belonging to Eddowes was later found nearby, along with mysterious writing on a wall, a message that would create even more panic. The police now faced a nightmare. The killer was becoming bolder. The attacks were escalating, and London was beginning to realise this was not over. By October 1888, Whitechapel was no longer just a poor district in London. It had become the centre of a global nightmare. Newspapers across the world were reporting the murders. People were terrified. Parents warned their children not to walk alone. Women feared the streets after sunset. And every man walking through the fog-covered alleys could become a suspect in someone's imagination. But while the public searched for a monster, the real killer was still free, watching, waiting. The shadow of suspicion. The police had a difficult problem. There was no modern DNA testing, no surveillance cameras, no databases, no digital evidence. They had only witnesses, physical clues, and their own instincts. And Whitechapel was a place where evidence disappeared quickly. Rain washed away footprints. Crowds destroyed crime scenes. Rumours became facts. Facts became rumours. The investigation became a battle against time. The police considered many possibilities. Could the killer be a doctor? Someone with medical knowledge? The victims had been cut with frightening precision. Some believed the murderer understood human anatomy. Others suggested he could be a butcher, someone used to knives, someone who worked with blood. But every theory created another question. If he was a skilled professional, why did he leave evidence behind? If he was inexperienced, how did he escape so easily? The letters of Jack the Ripper. The killer's letters became one of the most mysterious parts of the case. The most famous was the letter known as Dear Boss. The writer claimed to be the murderer. He mocked the police. He predicted future crimes. And he introduced a name that would become legendary, Jack the Ripper. But investigators had doubts. Was the letter written by the killer, or was it created by someone seeking attention? At the time, newspapers were competing for readers. A shocking story meant more sales. A mysterious killer meant huge public interest. Some later researchers believe journalists themselves may have created the famous nickname, a fake message, that accidentally created one of history's most famous criminals. But another letter was even darker, known as From Hell. It was sent to George Lusk, a member of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee. Inside the package was half of a human kidney. The writer claimed it came from one of the victims, and claimed he had eaten the other half. Whether the letter was real or a horrifying prank remains debated. But psychologically, it changed everything. The killer was no longer just a murderer. He became a symbol of evil. The final victim, Mary Jane Kelly, November 9th, 1888. A cold morning in London. Inside a small room at Miller's Court, the most horrifying discovery of the entire case was made. The victim was Mary Jane Kelly. She was only 25 years old, the youngest of the 5 famous victims. Unlike the others, she was killed inside her own room, a private space, a place where she should have been safe. The condition of the scene shocked even experienced investigators. The violence was extreme. The attack appeared different from the previous murders. The killer had more time, more privacy. No one interrupted him. No one saw him leave. And this created one of the biggest questions in the case. Was Mary Kelly killed by the same person, or was this a different murderer? Some investigators believed the killer became more violent because he was gaining confidence. Others believed the crime was too different. A copycat? Another criminal? The debate continues today. The killer disappears. After Mary Kelly's murder, the killings stopped. Completely. No more confirmed victims. No more messages. No more attacks. The police had several theories. Maybe the killer died. Maybe he was arrested for another crime. Maybe he was sent to an institution. Maybe he left London. Or maybe he simply stopped. And that was one of the most disturbing parts. A person capable of such violence disappeared into normal society. A neighbour, a worker, a stranger on the street, someone who may have lived an ordinary life afterward. The suspects. Over the years, more than 100 suspects have been suggested, but none have ever been proven. One of the most discussed suspects was Aaron Kosminski, a Polish barber who lived in Whitechapel. Police documents from the time mentioned him as a possible suspect. He was reportedly considered dangerous, but there was never enough evidence to charge him. Another theory pointed toward medical professionals. Because of the injuries, some believed the killer had surgical knowledge. Several doctors became suspects in later theories. But these ideas often relied on speculation rather than proof. There were also theories involving wealthy men, artists, and members of the upper class. The idea was simple. A rich man could enter poor areas unnoticed. A respected person could hide behind a normal identity. But again, no evidence ever confirmed these claims. The police failure? The failure to capture Jack the Ripper damaged public trust. Many people believed the police were incompetent. Others believed the investigation was simply impossible. Because the truth was, the killer left behind almost nothing. The police questioned thousands, investigated hundreds, but the final answer remained out of reach. The case became more than a murder investigation. It became a mystery, a story that grew larger with every passing decade. And the unknown identity of the killer created something even more powerful than fear, a legend. Music changes darker, but the biggest mystery remained. Not how he killed, not where he went, but this. Who was the man hiding behind the name Jack the Ripper? And was the answer buried forever? More than 130 years have passed. But the name Jack the Ripper is still alive. Not because we know who he was, but because we never found out. The greatest mystery of the case is not the brutality. It is the silence. A killer committed some of the most shocking crimes of the Victorian era, and then vanished. No confession. No trial. No final moment where justice arrived. Only unanswered questions. The search for the truth. After the final murder, investigators continued working. The case did not simply disappear. Detectives reviewed evidence. They followed new leads. They examined old suspects. But every path ended the same way. Nothing. The police had theories. One theory suggested the killer was local. Someone who knew Whitechapel. Someone who understood the streets. Someone who could disappear among thousands of people. This idea made sense. The murders happened in a small area. The killer appeared comfortable moving through dark alleys. He knew where victims could be found. He knew where witnesses would be unlikely. But another theory suggested something different. What if Jack the Ripper was not from Whitechapel? What if he came from outside? A visitor, a traveller, someone who entered the area only to hunt, then left before anyone realised. This uncertainty became the foundation of the legend. The killer could be anyone, and that was terrifying. The psychology of Jack the Ripper. Modern investigators and criminal psychologists have studied the case for decades. They ask, what kind of person commits crimes like these? The murders suggest planning. The killer chose vulnerable victims. He attacked at night. He escaped detection. But there was also chaos, extreme violence, risk, a desire to create fear. Some experts believe the killer wanted control. The victims represented powerlessness in his mind. The crime scenes became a way to demonstrate dominance. Others argue that modern theories may be reading too much into a case with limited evidence. Because the truth is, we do not know what was happening inside the killer's mind. And maybe that uncertainty is what makes the case so disturbing. A criminal without a clear motive, a face without a name, a story without an ending. The media created a monster. Jack the Ripper was not only created by murder, he was created by newspapers. Before 1888, crimes were reported, but the Ripper case was different. It became entertainment. Every detail was examined. Every rumour became a headline. People wanted answers. And newspapers gave them stories. Some were true. Some were exaggerated. Some were completely invented. The image of Jack the Ripper grew. A man wearing a dark coat, walking through fog, carrying a knife, waiting in the shadows. But the real person, whoever he was, may have looked completely ordinary. That is the terrifying possibility. The greatest monsters are not always obvious. Sometimes they blend in. They work. They speak. They live normal lives. The unsolved case. Today there are hundreds of books, documentaries and investigations about Jack the Ripper. Researchers continue searching for clues. Some analyse old police documents. Others examine letters. Some study DNA evidence. But every new theory creates another problem. A possible answer without proof. The case has produced many famous suspects. But suspicion is not evidence. A name and a theory does not mean guilt. And after more than a century, the identity of Jack the Ripper remains unknown. The victims behind the legend. But there is something important that can be forgotten. The story is often told as the mystery of a killer, but there were victims, real people. Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, Mary Jane Kelly. They were not characters in a horror story. They had families, dreams, memories. Their lives mattered. For generations, the killer's name became famous. But the victims deserve to be remembered too, because behind every crime scene, there is a person. Final theory. Maybe Jack the Ripper was never discovered because he was brilliant. Or maybe because the investigation happened at a time when technology could not catch him. A different era. Different methods. Different world. If the murders happened today, would the killer escape? With DNA testing? Cameras? Modern forensic science? Maybe not. But in 1888, the fog of London protected him. The streets protected him. And history protected his secret. Music builds. A killer walked through Whitechapel. He left behind fear. He left behind questions. And he left behind a name that would never disappear. Jack the Ripper. A man who became a legend because nobody ever proved who he really was. Final line, low voice. More than a century later, the greatest mystery remains. Not where Jack the Ripper went, but who he was before the world learned his name.